Now let's continue with applied ethics and advertising regulation. Now, advertising regulation need to consider ethics, but its role is not purely ethical. Now, public policy regulation is political and pragmatic, while ethics, its pure sense, it's the study of value in itself. Now, advertising regulations, it's political process in that it acts under the influence of complex interests. So the values that influence advertising policies are not always based on those of ethical goods, but on a trade-off between the competing interests of consumer lobbies and other interest groups, the right of citizens not to be gratuitously offended by commercial communication. So regulations exist as much to protect advertisers from the whim of the public as to protect the public from the excuses of advertisers. Nevertheless, there is an implicit ethical dimension to advertisers' code of practice. However, abstract advertising regulations may be breadth complex web of interest. It's rational at some level, it's to make life better or more acceptable in some way, what it would otherwise be without regulations, and this coherence with the Platonic ethical notions of universal justice. So, we might seek some clues as to ethical status of advertising by looking at the work of ancient and modern philosophers. Now, advertising is far from new evidence of promotional communication. Basically, it has been found in the ancient civilizations of Greece and Egypt. So modern advertising has been seen since the development of print media in the West some 400 years ago. In general, however, advertising as an aspect of commercial escape the specific attention of ancient philosophers. Now, it is probably fair to say that ancient philosophers would look upon advertising with some considerable approval, but we can still try to apply some concepts of Western philosophy in a way that might take into account the cultural visibility of ethical standard. Now, in ethical concept of judging advertisement itself, it can be useful to apply Western ethical concept to advertising, not because they offer solutions to debate and argument over advertising, but because they are clarify the ethical issues that are involved. Now, without some theoretical concept, it is impossible to move beyond the subjective views of individuals that particular ads are okay or not okay. So, deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics offer us three such useful concepts. Now let's look at the ethical concept for judging advertisement in deontology. Now, the ethical status of an act may be judged according to whether it is regarded as ethically good or bad according to a fixed standard. It's often applied to religious systems. Now, for example, if an ad promotes alcohol, beef, or pork, such ad might be deemed unethical by Catholics, Muslim, Hindus, and Jews, respectively, for whom consumption of this item runs counter to religious teaching. So, deontological judgment that rely on moral values that are seen as given and absolute. Now, clearly, deontological judgment on the ethical status of advertising have limits used where there is a wide divergence of view on what is intrinsically bad or good. So one could argue that most of all the world religions would agree that communication ought to be truthful and just and not coarse or vulgar, and hence there may be cases where an advertisement might be judged unethically or deontologically grounds by most religions and secular moral system. So the problem arises when different moral system applies different standards. And the key point about deontological ethics for advertising, it's the act in itself. So in this case, the advertisement that may be deemed ethical or unethical. Now let's continue looking at the ethical concept for judging advertisement, consequentialism. Now, consequentialism approach judge the consequences of an ad and not the act in itself. So, good or bad in this case may be concerned with positive or negative social effects. Now, a consequentialism approach seems to be taken by the United Kingdom regulator in allowing public service and charity ads that would not be appropriate if the motive were commercial. Case advertisement show in UK television has been quite upsetting, such as depiction of car crashes to encourage people to drive more carefully or wear seatbelt, and depictions of child cruelty to encourage viewers to donate money to children protection charity. So shocking people, shock advertising can get attention but has a poor record of success on a commercial level. So there is no proof that it is more successful for promoting charities or public safety, but it seems to be more justifiable as a tactic to get attention in those contexts. Now, the ethical concept for judging advertisement, virtue ethics. So virtue ethics consider that motive of the author of an act. So as a general ethical principles, people should be considered as end, not as mean. So if they are being considered merely as mean, then the ethical status of an act, such as an advertisement, should be regarded as negative and wrong. Now, on the other hand, if an act such as an advertisement is well-intentioned, then it might be regarded as ethically satisfactory, even if it is contravene fixed moral standard and result in negative consequences for some. So, in other words, in some regard as an actions of virtue ethics, since researcher regards ethical behavior as relative to personal circumstances. Now, for example, one might consider a coffee brand offer to give more money to coffee grower as a well-intentioned act that helped consumer feel morally better about drinking coffee, even if it might not make a huge difference to the coffee grower.